If you would like to earn CPE credit for listening to the show, visit earmarkcpe.com/FPA. Download the app, take a short quiz, and get your CPE certificate. If you would like to earn continuing education credit for your FP&A certification from the Association of Finance Professionals for listening to the show, go to the show notes for details on how to earn the credit. Finally, if you enjoy listening to FP&A Today, please go to your podcast platform of choice, click the subscribe button, and leave a rating and review of the show. And now, on to the show.
From Datarails, this is FP&A Today.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to FP&A Today. Today, we have a special guest host, Annette DeYoung. And you are listening to FP&A Today with her. FP&A Today is brought to you by Datarails, financial planning and analysis platform for Excel users. Every week, we welcome a leader from the world of financial planning and analysis and discuss some of the biggest stories and challenges in the world of FP&A. We'll provide you with actionable advice about financial planning and analysis today. This is going to be your go-to resource for everything FP&A related. And I'm thrilled to welcome today's guest on the show because today I get to be the guest and Annette gets to be the one interviewing me. So I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Annette now and let her ask the questions.
Hey, thanks, Paul. And it's great to be here as the guest host. I think I was a guest on this show. It's been months, but on one of the shows. And so, yes, the roles are a little switched today. And so now everybody who listens to you and watches you in the FP&A podcasts, now they get to actually hear more from you instead of the other guests in FP&A. So
yeah, so it'll be interesting to see how I do.
Yeah. Well, welcome to the show, Paul.
Thank you. Thanks for having me. Great to be here.
Yeah. So, you know what? We're just going to go ahead and get started. I have, I did post on LinkedIn, to see if there were any burning questions. I do have a few, but we're going to start with something a little bit more basic today. So, Paul, could you start by just giving us a little bit about you and your background?
Sure. Yeah. So I'll give you a little bit about my background. I actually started my career, funny enough, in procurement for the government. I was civilian, but I worked for the U.S. Navy for about 4 years writing contracts. Pretty quickly realized writing contracts for a career was not where I wanted to be long term. And ultimately made the decision to go back to grad school. I did a dual degree, an MBA in finance and a Master of Science in Information Management. And I went to work for American Express. At first, I was doing report writing and as well as also managing a cash forecast. And an FP&A role came open and it was a promotion. So I applied, not even really knowing what FP&A was, but going, hey, if I can make more money, I'm in. And, amazingly enough, I got selected and that started my FP&A career. That was, I'd say 2010, late 2009, somewhere in there, and been doing FP&A ever since. Worked for a few different firms, Solera, a global automotive company, DigiCert in the cybersecurity industry. And then started my own business just over a year ago in March of last year.
Wow. So I have to ask, the procurement for the government, and then you decided to go into finance and accounting. Like, what was your motivation there? I mean, other than procurement for the government.
Well, honestly, so the procurement part for the government, what I planned on going into, I originally was going to do more system type stuff because I had worked in a business systems office on a joint requirement board, kind of moving away from procurement. But when I took my advanced finance class, I'd always liked numbers. I really just fell in love with the class and decided to go more the finance route. I kind of wanted to do some investment banking stuff, but I graduated grad school in 2008. So that wasn't an option. The market wasn't in a place to hire somebody with no experience, to do that. And so I found a finance role that turned into FP&A and just kind of been doing it ever since.
Great. Thanks. So since we're going to kind of, focus on the FP&A, what is it about it that you absolutely love? Why did you decide, right, FP&A compared to maybe other parts of finance?
Yeah. So I think the thing I like most about FP&A is working with the business. It's the business partnering side. It's some of the areas where, some companies will also have you doing some of the operations. Like I've done a little bit of sales ops, a little bit of rev ops, but really it's the business partnering. It's helped driving the business forward, working with them. I've never really had outside I had one, but generally I've never had a corporate finance role. I've almost been always in the business unit supporting the business directly. And that's really what I liked in FP&A, and being able to make a difference, feel like you're impacting and knowing what's going on and seeing the whole business operate. Those are things I really enjoyed. Yeah, I mean, budgeting, forecasting, I like building a model, like figuring out drivers and trying to be close. Variance commentary and some of those things, yeah, not as much, but it's an important part of the job.
Yep. And so you mentioned that you've never held like a corporate finance position, always kind of like, SMB, right? Where everybody kind of works together. So, I come also from the same type of background where accounting and finance, they're usually only a couple of people, right? They're not completely separated from each other like they are in corporate finance. So how was that working with, of course you have a finance degree, but working with accountants, obviously one's kind of, looking at history, you're looking at the future. Kind of just give me some backgrounds on maybe some of those relationships between, right? Those, they're so close, but yet so far away.
Yeah, what was interesting when I first jumped into an FP&A role at one of the companies I worked for at American Express, we would post some of the journal entries. So that was kind of different, and a lot of our accounting outside of the controllership was offshore.
Okay.
So worked a lot with India. So definitely worked with them a lot and, had good relationships. I look at it as really a partnership. One of the big areas often we'd work a lot in is accruals, providing support, helping with audit sometimes and explaining how things were done. When I worked in the travel industry, it was American Express travel side. We had some different entries that were unusual for a lot of businesses, and they took a while to get the auditors comfortable and even some of the accounting people. And then as time went on, one of the more interesting, partnerships I had, well, kind of two. One, I was working with controllership a lot because we had some stuff in the business that we had to clean up because they've kind of been left to their own and they hadn't had any FP&A oversight. And this was international, some of our small markets. And so they were recognizing things not necessarily GAAP compliant. And so there was a lot of working with controllership very closely to try to bring them in line and standardize the approach. And then the other time that was really interesting where I had to work with actually treasury and accounting quite a bit is I did the forecasting for Travelers Cheques for American Express. And, 99%, almost 100% of our revenue came off the balance sheet. Either the interest we earned from all the liabilities that, from prior year sales and abandoned property. So we could take breakage revenue outside the US. And so we take a percentage, basically assuming some of it would be abandoned property and never getting cashed. And so that was really interesting because I'm trying to forecast calls for the portfolio I ran. Hey, when's this municipality going to call its bond early because of interest rates? And, do we have enough? Or are we going to have to sell some of these to manage our cash and things like that? So that was a really interesting one to coordinate with treasury and with, controllership around how the balance sheet accounts work, because that was the biggest piece of the business.
Yeah. And I think because I did, about 5 years in banking and yes, I will agree that coming in, the balance sheet is completely upside down compared to a normal business, right? Loans are assets, right? So, you almost have to relearn what you've learned in school when you're going into the banking industry for sure.
Yeah, no, for sure. And I've heard that. And just even doing Travelers Cheque and prepaid got a little bit of that banking experience. So,
yeah. So all of that excitement, why did you leave a full-time FP&A role to focus on consulting and teaching?
Why not? No. So, it was a long time coming as a journey. My undergrad, which not many people know, I did business management with an entrepreneurship emphasis. I wrote my first business plan my junior year of high school, and I came in fourth in the state competition. Wrote one again my senior year and came in fourth. And both years they messed up my score. So the teacher's like, hey, we're going to take you to the national events. I actually got to present at the National High School Business Association for a business plan. And so I'd always enjoyed writing business plans and the idea of business, but I'm by nature very conservative, as a lot of finance people are, and just never had an idea that one excited me, and two, the nerves go, hey, I'm going to go out on my own. And about a year and a half ago, a bunch of things came together with a number of different opportunities. Someone wanted me to do a course, some consulting stuff, some, influencer marketing deals with some vendors. And I told my wife, I'm like, hey, I think I can start my own business. And she looked at me like I was crazy. And we talked about it for the next, 6 weeks or so. And one day she's like, yeah, go for it. I'm like, you sure? Because I'm going to put in my notice today. So you better be sure. She's like, I'm sure. And put in my notice that day and been doing it ever since.
So basically you were made for this, right? I mean, obviously all the way from high school to today, it was just bound to happen eventually.
Fortunately, it did. I didn't think it would ever happen, but I've always wanted to own my own business. So it's kind of a dream come true.
Yes, it is. So looking back, I would say, I mean, this has only been, a few years, but I would say like maybe looking back over the past 15 years or so, what would you say, besides going out on your own, was like your biggest accomplishment?
Oh, that's a good question. I look back on my career. There's two that come to mind, but I'll share one. So I just started a new role with a company. They just put a new ERP in place. They had just went from every business kind of being their own portfolio where they were doing their own accounting. And they created a shared service. And this company had done, at this point, I think 54 acquisitions over the prior 12 years. So, and a lot of those were US. So there were, 30 plus legal entities and a lot of different businesses. And we had no good insight because the reports weren't very well built out when they first started the shared service. People were struggling. And so in my first few months, I went through and figured out there was this one report they had built. And I went ahead and I hadn't really used Power Query or Power Pivot at this point. I learned Power Query, figured out Power Pivot could work. At first, I was running it through an Access database because I didn't know what I was doing. And I got this report working that allowed everybody to see their budget and the actuals all the way down to the transaction in this Excel report. And that was within a few months. And eventually the business realized, because people kept asking about it, that it was needed, and they built it in some cubes. And it was used company-wide. I like to call it was the low-cost ghetto BI tool because they didn't want to invest at the time. They had other projects that were taking priority. But that was one I was proud of because 4 years later when I left, people were still using it.
So, yeah. So yeah, that is a great accomplishment, and that you really did change, I think, the way that the business was run. And
yeah, it made a big difference. The accountants were using it, the business was using it, and it helped people better research and understand results without having to, go through and look up journal entries in the general ledger, which takes forever and nobody wants to do.
Yeah,
unless they have to.
It's all that manual labor, right? You're right. Nobody wants to do it. And I think just because you created something that was used company wide, a lot of times we're trying to find ways in finance to teach the business to fish, right? Rather than always having to have the answer to the questions, right? And that's where I think, a lot of times we put in so many more hours, right? Because nobody has access to the data. They don't know how to use it or what it's for. So I think, creating something and allowing, educating those other business owners, if you will, right? That definitely seems to help, right? So that you can actually do things that I think are a little bit more, for the business rather than just digging into data.
Yeah, and that's where tools are so helpful when you have a good tech stack that can really bring light to those things. But sometimes you don't have that, and you have to figure out what works.
Yep, absolutely. That was it. The mother, invention is the mother, right? It's necessity, basically. It's that whole, work smarter, not harder. So we find ways.
Exactly. You're like, I can't continue to do it this way, so I'm going to find a better way. It's sometimes just you feel like you have no choice, right?
Yep. And then, of course, when you leave, somebody has to take that over. You were lucky that you actually had somebody to take that over. A lot of times, either you leave a company and it kind of dies on the vine, or you come into a company and now you have inherited something that's somebody else's brainchild and you have no idea how to use it.
We got macros everywhere and code, and you're just like, all right, well, if this breaks, I can't run the report this month.
And so what do we do when that happens?
Usually people start over.
Yep.
Most of the time.
Yeah. So starting over, what would you say is, your biggest, I would say, like I don't know, I'm not big on the word failure, but maybe your biggest like chance to learn in your career?
I've had plenty of those chances to learn. I like the way someone said it. They go, along those lines. I learned this when I was young. I was probably 20 when I first heard it. Might have been 21. Someone said, "I've never had a failure. I've only had a learning experience."
Yes.
And I really like that way of thinking about that. So I'd say one of my big failures are learning experiences. I was working for American Express, and we supported the end customers. What we did is it was before I had worked in FP&A. We ran these programs where we incentivized the agents to sell certain suppliers. And so it was what we call preferred vendors. And we do this preferred rewards program. And this one had this totally different way they wanted to do it. So I set up the database and got it all working and ran all the reports and sent them, and they paid them out. And then I realized, I think when I sent them, that I'd made a mistake in the weekly reports. I had put in some code somewhere and ran everything backwards. So we're actually paying the worst performers.
Oh no.
Instead of the best performers. It was a decent amount of money. I mean, it wasn't 6 figures, but it was 5 figures, and I had to bring that forward and explain. And that was a learning experience. It's just the importance of double and triple checking your work and making sure it's right. Then we had to pay the right people out of our budget.
Yeah.
Because, the vendor had already paid all the wrong people. So that was not a fun one. That was probably one of the more painful ones. Then there was the time I loaded fortunately it was Poland. So it was a very small economic country for us, but it got loaded all in the wrong currency for a budget one time. But at least it was a small country. I didn't load like the US all wrong.
That's true. A little different then, huh?
So on a global basis, it was barely even noticeable. But for that country, it was obviously an issue.
It was an issue, yeah. So, so you mentioned double checking, triple checking your work. What are some of maybe the tricks that you've learned and used over the years for that exact reason? Because we know we live and breathe spreadsheets.
When it comes to spreadsheets, I think, a couple things, you can put balances in place. If there's any actuals, make sure it ties. Like whenever I would load something, I had it when the models were built outside of the system and then loaded to it, and having a tie to check to go, okay, did what I have in the model all get loaded right? Is it all the right accounts? Because, we've all had it. Someone adds an account and it's not in your template. You're like, all right, I didn't know about that one. And you're like, why doesn't this tie? So first, having those checks throughout. If it's a 3-statement model, okay, does my balance sheet tie? I think doing sanity checks, having some good principles like, all right, I'm never going to hard code. I'm going to have a summary sheet. I'm going to have all my assumptions in clean places. So I think the biggest thing that helps, I've really learned, especially with starting the business over the last couple of years, is the importance of using good design principles so that your model is well structured and it's easier to identify. Because the reality is, and we've all probably heard the statistics, 90% of all Excel files have an error. Okay, yeah, that may be true, but how many of those are material?
Right.
Right. And that's part of it, because you can do sanity checks. I think one good one I've heard with some people is, right, put all your assumptions to 0, all your inputs, and see if your model goes to 0. I that's one I haven't used. Usually my models are very complex where it's hard to do that. But I think with some models, that's a really good idea, is going, okay, that tells you have a hard-coded number. Tells you something's obviously not right if you've turned all your inputs to 0 and you're still getting an output. So I think sanity checks also help. You should know the business well enough to be able to look at something and say, is this realistic? Does this look right? Right? Because there's times, if you know your job well, you should be able to spot material errors beyond just your checks. Some of that will just come from knowing the business.
So as somebody who's just starting out in their career in finance, just because you said knowing the business, what's a great way for those newcomers, right, coming into the business world to kind of get their leg and to start understanding the business when they don't have the experience?
Yeah, there's a couple things. So, one of the things I've done whenever I've gone into a new role is I try to figure out what are the industry kind of newsletters or magazines that are out there and read them to start learning about the industry. If there's competitors and they're public, read their 10K or their 10Q, listen to an investor call. Beyond that, those things you can do on your own is, talk to your boss about going out on a sales call or a sales meeting, about listening in to a customer support call, or if you're a call center, going for a day and listening to calls. So really making that effort to spend time with the business. Finally, I had a company where we were struggling to kind of bring employees on board, and we were bringing a bunch on board. And I said, look, we need to change the hiring process. And we went through and said, okay, the first week, we really don't want to have them do almost anything finance related. Let's just set up meetings today with the product, with the sales team, with the customer support, and just have them go out and learn the business. Then we'll walk them through what we know about it. And so they spent quite a bit of time and found that really helped them come up to speed a lot quicker. So I recommend, one, leaders have a program to onboard that's about more than finance. Focus it on the business in the early days. And two, if you're the employee, take initiative if they're not doing it, both on your own and within the company.
No, that's actually fantastic advice. Thanks. So what do you see as maybe the biggest opportunity and the biggest challenge going forward for FP&A professionals?
Yeah. So I think, industry, I think one of the biggest kind of opportunities, in some ways, challenges, and I won't say just FP&A professionals, I think finance in general as well, is how are we going to use AI? How is technology going to continue to change things? Right? I think everybody's been shocked to see how quickly, Chat GPT and these generative language learning models have started to be used, right? We're seeing tools. I know Datarails released something their own. I know, lots of other tools have. I know, Google's now playing catch up. So I think figuring out how you're going to use that and incorporate it in your work is one thing that needs to be done. And I think that's both an opportunity and in some ways it's a challenge, but I think it's mostly an opportunity. I think the other one is data, which goes both ways, is how are we going to get better at working with data and ensuring we have, good systems for data? Because there's just an overload of data today. What I read, every 18 months, the amount of data we're producing right now is equal to all the data we produced prior in our history, right? So basically we're doubling the world's data every 18 months. We've been around how many years? It's just amazing how quickly we're adding data. And so I think being able to work with it, being comfortable, being able to ensure you can know what systems to access and how to get the numbers you need. And not only get the numbers you need, but I think I'd say more important is how do you take out the noise? Right? How do you find the signal? What's important? How do you present that in a way that you can influence the business? So I think those are really two things I see as both kind of, some opportunities and challenges around them that I think will continue to get bigger. The use of AI and then managing data to drive the business forward. Because it's easy to just analyze data forever. But if you're not actually finding any insights or bringing recommendations, then you're just basically goofing off, so to speak.
Yep.
You know what it is like. 13 different spreadsheets emailed out to 23 different budget holders. Multiple iterations, version control, errors, back and forth updates. You never really feel in control of the consolidation and collection process. Yep, I've been there. Stop, breathe. Datarails is the financial planning and analysis platform for Excel users. Datarails takes data from all your company's disparate sources. No organization is too complex, consolidating everything into one place, secured in the cloud. Now all your data finally talking to each other. Everything is automated back into your report in Excel. Cash flow, FX conversion, intercompany transactions, now automated and up to date. Drill down and variance analysis in seconds. Don't replace Excel, embrace Excel. Turn your Excel into a lean, mean FP&A machine. Find out more at www.datarails.com.
So would you recommend, as again, right, in the FP&A career, whether you're just starting out or even if you've been doing it a while, knowing your audience right? So how would you recommend, right? So, because we, we do a lot of reports, right? A lot of analysis and a lot of output. So how would you cater almost like to the way that the way that you do your job, to really think about who your audience is and maybe what they need, because they're all going to be different.
Yep. So I think there's a couple different things, but I think the first thing it starts with is asking. Even when you're interviewing for a job, asking the person who's interviewing the boss, what are your biggest challenges? What are your priorities? Because, business partner loves nothing more than for you to help solve their biggest pain point. So I think it starts with asking and understanding, and then it goes much beyond that. So you build that relationship of trust, which I think is really important. You understand what their problems are and you solve some of them. Then the next thing is trying to think like your business leaders when you're putting presentations together. I was terrible for a lot of my career at this. Like, well, I love numbers and a table, so I put a table in everything. No, most people don't love a good table. Really learning to be able to use visuals that clearly tell the story and that anyone can understand. And that's something I've really learned a lot over the last few years. And I've bought a number of different books. I got one here, Effective Data Storytelling, Storytelling with Data, Show Me the Numbers. And, it's really helped to read best practice.
Mm-hmm.
And now every time I put a graph together, I really think, okay, what makes sense here? What will help me tell the story I need to tell, instead of, I like the way that looks and I can analyze that. Not what the executive wants to see.
Yeah. So, and that's funny because I actually do a bonus session for Christian when he does his FP&A boot camp. And we called it FP&A by design. And that's exactly what we're talking about, is how do you tell the story, right? You love the numbers, you love the table, you know exactly what it says, but give it to somebody who doesn't understand finance. If they can't understand what you're presenting, then it's no good. Right. And so
exactly.
We're trying to teach that FP&A by design, because there has to be purpose behind it rather than just a sheet full of numbers. So, yeah, great advice.
Yeah, totally agree.
So now I'm going to get a little personal.
Oh, no, I'm in trouble.
I know. So what is something interesting about you that not many people know? You have a lot of followers on LinkedIn, and I know you have a lot of followers on FP&A Today. So there's a lot of people who know a lot about you, but give us something that maybe not so many people know.
I'll tell 3.
Okay.
Because I usually use the combination of these when I do, truths and a lie. So, but these will all be truths. Okay. I met Jimmy Carter once. This was 2008. I was in the UK, in London. I was at Heathrow Airport. I got on a flight, and all of a sudden, the flight, some guy's going around shaking everybody's hand, and I see 2 security guys. I can see the earpiece and the suit. I'm like, oh, those are Secret Service. And I look, and I'm like, pretty sure that's Jimmy Carter. And the guy next to me goes, who's that? And he was from the US as well, older than I am. I'm like, you really should know who Jimmy Carter is. And he went around the plane and he shook everybody's hands before it took off.
Wow.
So that was one. Second, and now I'm old and out of shape, but I used to run marathons. I ran my first marathon when I was 17, and I ran a time quick enough at that time to qualify for the Boston Marathon.
Wow.
So that was an accomplishment I'm pretty proud of. Let's see. The third one is more embarrassing, but so I'm getting ready for a race one time, and I did have some spandex underneath, but I had my running shorts, and I pulled them off and didn't realize it with my tracksuit. And I ran the race. I had a long singlet, fortunately, so it wasn't very obvious. I ran the race and went to put back on my warm-ups and realized my shorts were sitting in them. So, fortunately, like I said, I had a spandex underneath, so I wasn't running in the breeze, but it was still embarrassing nonetheless. So there you go. Not many people would know those 3.
That is true. You can't Google that and find that out, right?
No, fortunately, none of those are on Google.
I love sometimes we talk about, this was before the internet. We have no proof of any of this.
Yeah, and it's a good thing, because I did a lot of stupid things as a kid that I'm glad there's not proof of. Nowadays, there's proof of almost everything. You put something online and it's never going away.
Ever. I know. So
and kids don't realize that.
So we actually do have a couple of questions from some of your followers. So
All
I want to make
righty.
sure to kind of include these in our interview today. So
All
I'm
right.
going to read this one here. It says, do you believe that in the near future, we could see more CFOs which have started as FP&A roles and they don't have CPA certification?
We're already seeing it. We're seeing more and more of that. And I think we'll continue to see it. Interesting. If you go back and listen, I had Casey Wu on, I think it was episode 38, roughly. And he came from investment banking, not a CPA background. He's been a CFO, I think 5 times now with startups. And he commented how the CFO is in the future going to be more like the chief business intelligence officer. And what he meant by that is not we're going to do the technical work, but we really need to own the data. He referred to how you could tell a modern CFO because they'll put analytics under finance. And so we're seeing more and more come from CFA because it's becoming much more important to be that right-hand man to understand the commercial, just understand the strategic, the analytics, and a lot of those things fall under FP&A. Whereas, you can still come from the controller and the CPA background, and that's a great background, but a lot of that's being automated and viewed more transactional and governance and regulation. And those type of things today where FP&A often gets a much closer view to the business. So I think that's why you're seeing more come from FP&A. But both routes have their benefits, and you can become a CFO either way.
No, I completely agree. And so I think I was reading that there was a poll that was done with CFOs and that they see themselves as like the most manual job in the C-suite. Would you would you agree with that?
Unfortunately, yes, I would agree with that. I mean, I think, I was reading I wrote an article about the use of AI. And I mentioned in there, I had found a chart that showed finance is using AI, kind of that modern technology, the least of all the departments. And I think, there's multiple different reasons for that. And then the second thing I think that's a challenge is, finance has to usually put together the data and the metrics across the entire business. They're usually the ones who own a lot of those operational metrics reported at a company level, which means they're getting into every single system. The sales guys typically just getting into Salesforce and maybe a marketing tool, and the operations guys getting into has 2 or 3 systems. Where sometimes FP&A, yes, there'll be a data warehouse sometimes, some of that, but often they're still getting into multiple different systems. And that can be very manual because, especially if it's a very mature company that's been around for a long time, they got a lot of older tools that don't always speak well to each other.
Yeah. So
You're laughing because I think you can relate to
I
that
definitely can relate to that one. And so going back to not just the AI, but technology itself in finance. It seems, in that bell curve, we are laggards, right? When it comes to adopting, especially new technology. Now, I'm not saying all, right? A lot of times startups, they're going to be the
Sure.
first in line. But to your point, when you already have a business that's been established, right? What do you think is really holding back the finance department as far as, right, relying on tech to kind of help with that day to day, other than probably trust issues?
Yeah. So I think I would say probably 3 things if I was to think about it. First is just investment. Often finance is the last one to get it unless it's regulatory, right? If I got to legally meet it, like if I want to go public, I know I got to fix some systems because the last thing I can afford is to restate my public earnings because my accounting system screwed something up or a person screwed it up because the system was a mess, right? And so I think that's often where investment comes from. So I think there's a challenge because, if you're a CEO, do you want to invest in a finance tool or you want to have that salesperson? Salesperson's easier to quantify. That sales system is often more direct. So I think there's a little bit, we said, and the CFO looks at his limited dollars and usually is saying, okay, I can band-aid this. My team can manage it. I want to make sure we hit that top line number. So I'm going to invest it in the business first. So I think that's one reason. I think, that's one challenge. I think some of the others is you look at, finance and there's the trust issue, like you mentioned, but going beyond that, kind of the black box idea, right? If we can't get our hands on it and understand every little number, we're afraid to put it in place. And that's one of the reasons Excel is so loved. right? Anyone can get their hands on Excel and look through it. And then I think in general, we often sometimes are the busiest roles and we don't invest enough time in our self-development. And I think in many ways that is often the biggest issue. I mean, look at Power Query. It's been around now since I think 2012. And I would bet of FP&A professionals, 10% are using it, 20.
Really?
Power Pivot.
You think it's that low?
Yeah, I do.
Wow.
I bet it's under 50% for sure, at least in my experience. Dynamic arrays, right? I mean, I teach Excel and I ask how many people know dynamic arrays. And in the room of 20 on average, I might get 2 or 3 hands. I'll ask how many know Power Query. If it's a good group, half of them know it.
Okay.
And this isn't just FP&A. These are finance in general. I don't think I've been in one room where the majority of the people are using it in a training yet.
Okay.
And so I think that's a huge issue. If we're not even using Excel effectively, why would we expect to be using all the other tools that are becoming available in addition to Excel to help us? So I think upskilling is the other area that really we need to do a better job.
Great. So speaking of Excel, you know, we have to ask, right? What is your favorite Excel function and why?
I shouldn't say Google Sheet. I'm kidding. Let's see. Favorite Excel function. So my favorite feature in Excel, definitely I would say it right now is Power Query. I love Power Query. And then beyond that, really, I'm going to go with the set of functions versus just one. So I'm going to cheat.
Okay.
But I figure I get to do that.
It's your show.
It's really the whole set of dynamic arrays. I love unique, XLOOKUP, the new set of arrays. I mean, in fact, this will tell how big of a nerd I am. I bought this book, and I know those people on the audio can't see it, so I'll read it, but it's Up, an Array. It tells you how much of a nerd I am. That's the name of the book. Dynamic Array Formulas for Excel 365 and beyond. And I was reading it up, finishing it on my plane ride last week. So.
Don't feel bad. You would not believe how many Excel books I had over my career too.
Yes. So I love some of the things you can do with all these new formulas now that used to be a nightmare.
Yep. So, Excel has really come a long way, obviously from the beginning, which was a really, really long time ago. And I might date myself a little bit, but my first job that I ever used spreadsheet software, it was not Excel.
Well, in high school, when I wrote my business plan, it was Lotus
1, 2, 3. Yep. That was my first, exposure, if you will, to spreadsheets. Excel, obviously, quote unquote, excels at it. It's been around a really, really long time. And we do see, though, that there are a lot of people that are moving to Google Sheets, right? How do you feel about like FP&A using Google Sheets? I know I see the look on your face, but you would not believe how many people I run into that tell me they're a Google Sheets shop.
Honestly, Google Sheets has benefits over Excel. Excel has benefits. I think it comes down to, whatever makes the most sense for your company. I haven't used Google Sheets a lot. I do like that it's cloud-based. It does have some unique, formulas that Excel doesn't. For the most part, 90% of the formulas are the same. I'd say, probably one of the bigger strengths of Excel is it can handle a lot more data. Google was designed for the cloud and was originally designed. It wasn't designed to handle a lot of data. And so, some of the benefits are, hey, if you're an overall Google shop, right, then it integrates really well. If it's all cloud-based, there's a little bit of better version control and security. Some of the things I know Datarails adds to Excel that you don't get real well natively. I know they've done things to improve that, but I don't think anyone feels like the collaborative experience in Excel is great. Like, we're not going to write home about it, but it's come a long way. It's definitely a lot better. And so I think, there's pros and cons, and you have to decide as a shop what makes sense for you. There's even some new startup spreadsheets out there, and I've seen some pretty cool things with some of them that, do unique things. And, spreadsheets, the best thing is you can learn almost any spreadsheet and it's going to transfer pretty well. 80, 90%. Like if you learned on Google Sheets, it's going to be very similar in Excel. And then if you decide to switch to equals. So I think that's one of the biggest advantages of spreadsheets in general versus, planning tools. I get Datarails as a planning tool that uses Excel, but I mean, they have their own proprietary language. It may not transfer as easily.
Right.
And so that's one of the nice things about spreadsheets. So that's kind of where I stand, and I can see the benefits of both, but I don't use Google much. I'd say the most I used it is I had to prepare a training for a company and they were on Google. So I had to take all my models and figure out how to build them in Google. It was the first time I've had to do something like that. So that took a while.
Oh, I bet.
So
and it's funny because when Microsoft went from, was it 64,000 lines to now we're well over 1 million.
yes.
I think every finance and accountant, professional out there like leaped for joy because we're like, oh my gosh, we can actually bring all of this data in. But I don't think Excel realized how much we started using Excel as a database. And that too kind of has its challenges, right? If you will. And that's why we leverage other tech.
Yes. A couple funny stories around that. First is I decided to try. So there's 1.2 million rows, was like 16,000 columns, I believe. So it works out to, 2 billion cells, roughly, something like that. I tried writing a sequence formula that's an array to see if it could fill the entire worksheet. You can't do it. There's not enough memory on your computer. I think you would need, someone told me, instead of 64 gig, you need like 1.2 terabytes of RAM to process a sheet that size, which just goes to show, yes, there is a huge number, but it's just not realistic in a spreadsheet. It's not a database
right.
to be trying to use every single row and column. And the second is one time I inherited a file from somebody that was 1.3 gigabytes in Excel. They were using it as a database. They were doing the billing every month for like the last 3 years and, getting the, a cohort churn analysis from it. And, they weren't saving it as an XLSP. They weren't getting rid of old data. I mean, we did just a few things that had it down to like to 300 meg. I say that loosely. And I was like, this process didn't last long. I'm like, I can rebuild all this. You can get it in Power Query. I could probably have the process so it takes about 2 minutes each month. And you don't have these files that take 5 minutes to open. But it never happened. They had some switches and rolled off that job.
Yeah.
But that was one of my favorite when I'm like, it's 1.3 gig. Like, what are you doing?
That's huge. And
yes.
When I talk to people, I always refer to my coworkers, Al and Frank, and those stand for Albatross and Frankenstein. And those are spreadsheets, right? Because
yes,
Albatross, so to your point, right? 1.3 meg, it's huge because it just becomes unwielding at some point. But it started out as Frank, right? Where somebody, usually your CFO, asks for something. And to get it done quickly, you just do it, not thinking that you'd ever have to do it again. And then you continue to add on to it. Yeah, that's great. But now can you do? And then you get to that point where Frank turns into Albatross.
I like that. I hadn't heard it that way. I usually refer to them as Franken models. I built a few of those over the years, but I had Frank and Al. I have to remember that. I like that, but it's very true. You keep bolting stuff on and you don't think about the structure because you just need to get it done.
Mm-hmm.
And before you know it, you got hard-coded numbers, you got sheets with no name and hidden sheets, and it's just a big mess.
Yeah. And before I left FP&A, that was kind of, they made fun of me. I actually have a placard because anytime I'm like, do you want it right? Or do you want it right now? Because you're going to get something different.
So true.
Because and to your point, right? Especially in finance, we're so busy all of the time. And that's why we don't adopt, is one of the reasons you said why we don't adopt new tech, why we don't adopt, right? Bringing in other solutions to help us do our job. Number one, we just don't have the time. And so we tend to, just put it together, right? Because somebody needs it yesterday. And that's like step one, right? That's where the problem started. Right? That's the root cause right there. And so, yeah, I have learned to kind of set those expectations because if you want it right now, you're going to get a different output than if you just let me have the time to do it right.
No, so true. I remember we had a new CFO and he would stand over the shoulder of people who were sitting there waiting for the report. And the one girl finally turned to him and she's like, you're not helping things. Like, it's going to take a little while. Just go sit down and relax. and I'll bring it to you when I'm done. I need some time to ensure I get you the right numbers. But he would literally just stand. Unfortunately, I was remote, so he couldn't do that to me. But he would stand over people's shoulder, and I'd see a traveler just waiting. And then the one finally, I'm like, just go calm down, relax for a minute, and let me get you the right number.
I think we've all worked for those, right? For people just like that. Yeah. So that leads me into my last question, which again was a LinkedIn question. How do you feel FP&A improves business performance?
Great, great question. And I think there's a few ways, but I think one of the best ways it improves performance is to be there with the business, understand strategy, and help ensure that the programs they have are resourced appropriately, that they're realistic estimates to it, and that there's a solid strategy there to help the business go forward. And that's why it's so important to understand the business. I still remember, and this is one of the, compliments I'm probably most proud of in my career. And I'd worked really hard to get to know this business and I've been very involved. I had a business leader when I left. He goes, he's like, you don't just report the P&L, you help shape the P&L. And his idea was you're helping influence the numbers by helping us make good decisions. And that's really what it comes down to. Ultimately, we're stewards of capital under the office, under the CFO. And our job is to help ensure the business best uses that capital to help us grow. And if that's being done, if we're, building good models, we're providing good insights, then we can really add value, and that's rewarding. I mean, for me, the other thing that's extremely rewarding, it has nothing to do with that, is just training somebody, right?
Right.
Seeing someone develop and grow. But that isn't so much the business, but it can be in the sense of if you train good people, then you're leaving the business better than when you came.
Great. So before we wrap up our podcast today, is there anything else that you would like to share with, I would say your viewers, on FP&A Today?
I'll just say thank you for listening, and it's kind of been fun to be on the other side of the mic for a change, and just appreciate, how many people listen. I didn't realize how big this would become, and I totally love doing it, and I'm grateful for everyone out there who takes the time to listen and keep the notes coming. I love to get the emails, the messages from people saying, hey, I listened and this episode helped me with this, or I really appreciate what you're doing. And so just a big thank you to the audience and a thank you to you for playing host today.
Yeah, it was my pleasure. Thanks, Paul.
Thanks, Annette. Appreciate it.